All right, everybody, welcome. We'll let everyone kind of jump in and get settled. We appreciate everyone joining for today's conversation with the Play Sports Coalition and really talking about what's happening in Washington. Obviously, a big day yesterday, and understand the implications on youth sports and what this means for you in terms of more relief, more support for youth sports organizations. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Jeremy Goldberg. I'm the president and quarterback at League Apps. Izzy's known me for a while, so no laughter about me being a quarterback. In 7th and 8th grade, I can still claim that. But I'm fortunate enough to be one of the co-chairs and founders of this Play Sports Coalition and really help lead today's conversation. And I want to start with a few kind of observations, as we jump into the conversations that I hope you will both take away practical ideas about what's happening and how you can influence that in a broader kind of understanding of the moment that we're at. But when I think about where we're at as a country and the things that we've experienced over the past few weeks and over the summer, this conversation about who we are as a country, how do we come together as a community, questions about equity and access, the youth sports world, you all are on the front lines of that work and those conversations. I thought it was powerful when Ben Sasse, who's the Republican senator from Nebraska, the night of the riot and insurrection on Capitol Hill, spoke about Little League in his conversation, and he said, in America, we need to figure out how to build that sense of community again, right? And as much as people look at in Washington and look to government, that really happens in neighborhoods, right? And how we get to know each other. And that happens through little leagues. And that I think is just an illustration of why youth sports is so important right now. That was the message that the new President Biden said yesterday, right? How is it that we're coming together despite our differences, political difference, racial difference, right? All the other things that might divide us, and figure out, how we have some sense of common purpose and how we get to know each other and rebuild that kind of fabric. And so youth sports, I think, is an important and critical component to that. And I think the other thing we acknowledge is how difficult of time it is for all of your organizations, whether it's the regulations that are being imposed in terms of how you can operate, the financial duress and stress that you have. There's questions of how you're going to survive, especially if you're more indoor sport oriented that can't even operate. And so we understand that, right? And that is why the coalition exists, is to fight for you and push for you and try to be there on the Hill and advocate to make that happen. So today's conversation is about that. And the final thing is, there was a moment yesterday, if many of you may have seen it, it's gone viral, about Amanda Gorman, who's the youth poet laureate, that talked about the resilience of young people. And she was someone who was raised by a single mother, that she had found her voice through poetry. And you saw the power of youth, right? The optimism, the hope, the next generation. But it's worth also thinking about an organization like America's Scores, right? An amazing nonprofit that actually pairs soccer with poetry. And I couldn't help but think, as I watched her amazing words, to think about the work that America's Score is doing and so many other organizations that are doing, that are part of this coalition, right? That are part of this effort, that really have an ability to develop youth, that it's not just about the future, it's about now. So with that, we're going to jump into it. And I think, the other thing is that we're going to get through this, right? People understand why youth sports is important. They understand that we need this industry to survive and thrive. And so we really want to use today's conversation to help that happen. So I want to start the conversation today by bringing in two speakers, Izzy Klein and Tom Nally, who are going to help us get practical about what passed the Hill in all of the kind of things that were going on at the end of the year, and how to take advantage of that. And for today's conversation, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So use that Q&A tab to go ahead and share questions that you have, very specific questions that we can pose to Tom and Izzy that we can resolve here, or we could also take advantage of the Next Up Industry Slack group as well. And we'll put that link in the chat as well. Tom Nally is with Alvarez and Marsal. He has expertise in tax and in law. He also happens to be a huge LSU fan, and he's the coolest and smartest tax and legal authority I know. So we're amazing for you to kind of give your time and energy here. And as I mentioned earlier, Izzy Klein is someone I've known for a year. He's the co-founder of the Klein Johnson Group. He was on the Hill for many, many years. He worked as the top communications aide to Senator Chuck Schumer, who's now the majority leader as of yesterday. He also worked for Ed Markey and has been lobbying and advocating for almost a decade in a few different roles. And he heads this bipartisan lobbying and policy shop that was actively involved in a lot of these relief efforts. So we'll start with that conversation, then we'll bring Terry and Benita into the conversation later. So Tom and Izzy, Tom, I want to start by putting a practical question for you, which is there's something that passed at the end of the year, more small business relief, more aimed at PPP. What are the things in there? What are the goodies in there that can really help you sports organizations? I know we, with Terry's leadership, really advocated hard to try to influence their ability to focus on small organizations and medium-sized organizations that use sports. So what are the things that they should know about?
Thank you, Jeremy. Obviously the big ticket item in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and I'm just going to call it the year-end stimulus deal. Izzy may have a more elegant abbreviation for it than I do. The big ticket item obviously is what's known as second draw PPP. And very similar to the first round of PPP, which is established under the CARES Act and then reformed under or expanded under a predecessor bill. It's another round of forgivable loans. It's a slightly smaller budget than, it's about roughly half the size in terms of budget as the first round of PPP. There are a few additional requirements, including having to show at least one quarter in 2020 where a company had at least a 25% decline in gross receipts compared to the same quarter in 2019. Still have an employee headcount limit. Also, there's a limit of, I believe, $2 million per loan recipient. Could be wrong. Could be 2.5. But all in all, in terms of the overall structure of it, not dissimilar from PPP one. You can similar period for the loan forgiveness, similar process in terms of an initial application with your bank and then an application for forgiveness. So that's still, from my perspective, the first round of PPP was vital to supporting small businesses last year. I worked with a lot of companies that are, I would consider, small to mid-size. Some of them were in industries which were unaffected by COVID. Some were in industries, fortunately for them, they're almost counter-cyclical to COVID. And then I have others in industries like commercial aerospace, energy, and a few others, hospitality and tourism, who were really hurt. And call it an antidote, but all of my clients survived and were largely able to maintain their payroll due to PPP. It was
right. So Tom, but before we go in, because one thing I think the group will really find value from is a lot of the tax credit provisions that may get talked about less, but that are pretty impactful for everyone. Izzy, as we think about the PPP, the two things I think I want to focus on is one, is any of the adjustments that you think are modifications. I think one of the things that happened is some more flexibility about the way that you could use the money, some on the expense side. Right. The second thing is just speak to the reality that, and we'll get into this also in looking forward, that for organizations that aren't as payroll focused, right? They have more, they're more 1099 workers, right? Which tends to be a majority of you sports organizations. The formulas seem to leave them behind. So how did that decision come in? So to talk to us a little bit about what's in it, and then also the way that they treated kind of non-payroll 1099 folks.
So I think a couple things, and I'll defer to Tom on the specific treatment of 1099 since he's the tax expert. But I will say that PPP eligibility was expanded for a number of groups that were not included in the first place. Okay, those included destination marketing organizations in the travel and tourism space, and those included many nonprofits that are organized under different sections of the tax code that were prohibited, in fact, from taking a first round PPP loan. So the pool has been opened up a little bit for those who can qualify. Also restarted were the idle loans that were paused for quite a bit of time. Those are smaller emergency loans, often for sole proprietorships, for very small businesses, for nonprofits, et cetera. Those have a cap of about, I think, $10,000 or $20,000, and those are. It's important to note that those get a new little lease on life. The other thing that I'll add that was also an important adjustment is that forgivable expenses and permitted tax deductions have been expanded as well. So if you're a nonprofit in this space, that's a good thing. But also, if you're a service provider, to a group of organizations. If you're a, software as a service provider, right? For instance, the expenses that an organization was making that are kind of business critical to, to host the website, to provide database services, to provide accounting services, et cetera, right? All of that stuff is now considered a forgivable expense, which, is not insignificant. And it certainly makes sure that business critical systems that an organization needs to utilize aren't going to be kind of charged against them for taking these PPP loans. And so those are a couple of the important tweaks that happened. The SBA does have some additional flexibility and authority here. And as they kind of get some new leadership and roll out potentially new FAQs and guidance, you could see some additional flexibility given to other organizations and to other parts of the program.
So Izzy, there's a couple good things to unpack there. One is there's more eligibility, which in most cases is probably not going to impact youth sports organizations specifically, unfortunately. The flexibility on expenses, I think, is important. One of the things that you can find, and I think the advice to people out there, is if you took PPP money in before, there was an expectation or focus of how you spent that money, and a lot of it was around rent, and then payroll were kind of the big categories. Now, if it's things like you're buying masks or you're buying certain kinds of things to allow you to run your programs, if you're have technology needs around that, right? If you have other kinds of service related needs around that, there's more ways that you could spend money as you're running your programs if you're not having to invest back in that payroll or that staff, depending on where you're at. So that, and you have a longer time horizon from the very beginning to spend it. So that should benefit you sports organizations as you incur expenses to have more things that are eligible and still be eligible for forgiveness, where you don't have to pay back the loan at all, right? It's really a free grant, provided that you have at least 60% of that money going towards those payroll costs. That led to the next question, Tom, before we get into kind of the future stuff and the tax credit stuff, which is you have a lot of organizations that are sole proprietorships, LLCs, 1099 based kind of employee bases. It feels like, is it fair to say that those organizations are not assisted by or not helped directly by the PPP provision? Is that a fair point?
Companies that are sole proprietorships or individuals working as independent contractors, they can tap into. My understanding is they can tap into PPP, similar to First Draw. I'm going to defer to Izzy on if there are any big changes in that space. A lot of my focus has been on organizations that have employees and are looking to support payroll, but it's definitely not limited to big organizations. If you're a solo practitioner or independent contractor, you should still look into second draw PPP, similar to the first draw.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, and we'll get into this when we talk with Terry and Izzy about the future, is that if you have a lot of 1099s, they individually, like your coaches are 1099s, they individually have to file. That helps them, but you as an organization aren't in a position to receive that money and then do that the way it's currently configured. Now, to Izzy's point earlier, while Congress passes the legislation, right, and they can pass more legislation, there is rulemaking that happens at the SBA level that there may be ways that through advocacy and through their interpretation could help shift and expand that. So that is again, a cause that the Play Sports Coalition is behind. And Terry can speak to a lot of things that we advocated before. Tom, before we leave this section, just to be practical, what were other things that help small organizations, businesses, for-profit, nonprofit, especially around tax credits? I think there's some things in there that I think are important for people to know.
Sure. So Jeremy, from my perspective, one of the biggest and best changes in the act was the expansion and enhancement of the employee retention tax credit. And I'll just, since that's kind of a mouthful, I'll just refer to it as the ERC from here out. So the ERC was established in the CARES Act, just like PPP. But for most small companies, it was a non-issue because there was a prohibition in the CARES Act of claiming the ERC if you're also receiving a PPP loan. The act at the end of this year, the year-end stimulus deal, eliminated that prohibition both prospectively and retrospectively. So companies who received a PPP loan in 2020 can actually look back into that year, see if they would have qualified for the employee retention credit, and retroactively make those claims. And we can get into a little bit more how those claims can generate cash and actual savings. And then prospectively, the credit originally sunset at the end of 2020. It was extended through first and second quarter of 2021. So we now have 2 quarters in 2021. It was also enhanced. So originally, the credit was limited to effectively $5,000 per employee. For 2021, it's been raised to up to $7,000 per employee per quarter. So theoretically, a business can max out at $14,000 for 2021 per employee in 2021. You still have the $5,000 limit for 2020. The reason why these credits are powerful is unlike other federal income tax credits, these credits actually go against or technically go against a company's Social Security taxes, which every company has to pay on its employees. The credit is also refundable, meaning to the extent a company has more in credits than it does in quarterly Social Security tax, or what's known as OASDI, that overage is simply refunded back to the company as opposed to carried back or carried forward. So it's monetized a lot more quickly. It's also advanceable, meaning let's say that you determine that you have a credit for the first quarter of the year, and you don't want to wait till first quarter closes to receive the cash rebate. You can actually file an application with the Internal Revenue Service to receive an advance payment of that credit. That program we're actually waiting for the IRS to publish a new form and a little bit of guidance, but I'd anticipate within a week or so, we'll actually have an updated form there. So it's potentially very material, up to $7,000 per employee per quarter for Q1 and Q2 of this year. It's refundable, meaning it will come back in the form of cash one way or another. And it's advanceable at the same time, meaning you can get to it pretty quickly. The last thing I'll say about it though is while a PPP recipient can now claim an employee retention credit, there is some prohibitions on using the same dollars for the same benefit. So the wages that are used by a PPP recipient for their loan forgiveness calculation cannot be the same wages used for employee retention tax credit. So that's going to require some, retrospectively, if a company wants to claim employee retention credit, that will require some analysis. Prospectively, it'll require some planning, kind of looking to stagger or ladder the employee retention credit with PPP forgiveness.
So I think that's really helpful. And again, I think to translate for everybody here, basically, if you have employees on payroll, right, there's the PPP aspect of it. But the other thing is that by just keeping them on payroll, you can get a credit from the federal government in the form of cash for that as well, that you have access to, and that's an expanded amount of money. So that those are both ways to help. Again, all of this, I think, Tom, still works within the construct of full-time or part-time employees on payroll, not in the situation where we have 1099s, which unfortunately is where a lot of nonprofits are. So I think that gives us the picture, Tom. Anything else that we need to know about this particular legislation? Because now we're getting in the business of talking about what's moving forward, and it's in the context of relief and everything else. Because I think that's where, if there's people that are out there that haven't been helped, that's where the Play Sports Coalition is doubling down on our efforts. And we think, again, the environment allows us to believe that we can make an impact here. So anything else you want to say, Tom, before we let you go?
No, I'm so busy with the changes to the recent law. I haven't had much of an opportunity to contemplate the future, but we'll do
that for you. And our hope is to make you even busier when you can come back on here and explain all the amazing things that this government can do to help the most important industry, in my mind right now, one of the most important industries, right, that are helping to bring this country back, which is how we're serving our kids, not just through schools, but through sports. So thank you, Tom, for being here. Sorry, LSU didn't have quite the season you did this year, but you always had last year. So we appreciate you being there. Thank you very much. And I'm going to welcome Terry Lakowski into the conversation. As Terry joins, you all should be familiar with her if you've attended these kinds of conversations before through the Play Sports Coalition. She's the CEO of Active Policy Solutions, which is a government affairs and public affairs and advocacy firm. And she is a longtime advocate and expert in the world of youth sports and participatory sports, and has been a champion of this industry as much as anyone. So thank you, Terry, for joining us. And I really want to start to kind of turn our attention to the future a little bit. about what's happening, what can happen. And again, hearing from all of you in that Q&A tab, I know there's a question from Melissa that we'll talk more specifically about, is like, where are your needs not being met? Where are there opportunities to influence that through the relief, recovery, appropriations? And there's also some kind of a breaking action that the Trump administration did that was just brought onto my radar screen by the Aspen Institute before the call that we also want to talk about as well. So Izzy, I'm gonna ask you to give us the legislative kind of environment. You worked with Schumer for years. He's now has even more of a role here as setting the agenda in the Senate. What is this? What is the dynamic? Paint the picture of what's happening in Washington? And then ultimately, how does that create an environment that might impact or influence how youth sports organizations are interfacing with government?
Thanks, Jeremy. And look, I think that we saw kind of the beginning of the new government posture yesterday. There was a lot of activity, both on the administration level, starting in with executive orders, key appointments being made, and then, as you mentioned, control of the Senate shifting from Mitch McConnell to my former boss, Chuck Schumer. And that was because of 3 seats or 3 new senators being sworn in, the new one from California taking Kamala Harris's spot, and then the 2 in Georgia who won very close seats and turned out Republican incumbent senators. And so the chamber is 50-50. This has happened 3 times before. And the last time was in 2001. And it is a very unusual and challenging environment. But Majority Leader Schumer made it very clear that he is going to be aggressive on the legislating front. And he's going to want to push through as many of the Biden nominations, confirmations as possible, as quickly as possible. And along with filling the government with competent people, he has made clear that COVID relief is going to be one of the top 3 priorities for the Senate in the near term. And so, Biden has signaled a plan worth, $1.9 trillion. A big portion of that, I saw one of the questions earlier, a big portion of that is really dedicated towards education and getting schools back up and running. That includes extracurriculars, getting teachers vaccinated, and getting the system set up for a return to normalcy. And that's a big component in addition to the additional business assistance, in addition to the vaccine rollout and whatnot. In addition to trying to address racial equity issues and a whole host of other things, child poverty, et cetera. So I think that there's a kind of a robust conversation that's going to happen, both at the committee level in the House and Senate, and at the leadership level and on the floor.
So Izzy, just on that specifically, and then I'm going to bring in Terry, because I think the quick follow-up on this is, we were doing all kinds of great work and had an influence, with I don't know, Terry will talk more about this. We spent time with hundreds of offices and 50 champions and things like that. But at the end of the day, if everything's being done at the last minute and it's 4 leaders in a room making decisions, you can only influence, or those opinions are only certain people who might be able to influence or get to them based on the perspectives they have. Are things going to be differently now? Like, how is the Senate? How is the administration? Like, how does that influence the way that, if you're advocating on behalf of a worthy industry, how should we think about that as we're pushing ahead as a coalition and moving together forward?
Look, I think, I've told you this before, and I tell all of our clients that we talk to, there's no one magic phone call or email or text that an organization can send in order to enact a legislative priority, change laws, tweak a regulation, et cetera. You really need a thoughtful, strategic campaign that combines PR and policy and real legislative, outreach and kind of lobbying, boots on the ground, et cetera. You guys have a great grassroots coalition that you've built over the last year. And that's really what needs to drive the messaging and the outreach. But I do think that being in play in both the House and the Senate, and having conversations, the right conversations with folks in the administration, will increase your chances of enacting, any 1, 2, 3, 4 of the key policy priorities that the coalition has been pushing for.
Awesome. Well, that's a good place, because the kind of tip of the spear of that strategy, Terry, has been you and your team. I don't think I've ever watched anyone work any harder at their job than you. I think I remember seeing JJ Watt practicing and videos of him practicing the Texans after practice for hours. And I think that's kind of, I imagine you in the way that you and your team were talking and working so hard, talking to all the offices. So when you think about where things are at right now, with all the efforts we've had, what's your perspective of what's happening on the COVID relief side? And then where you see there's opportunities or in the priorities around relief from the perspective of this coalition?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I may be a little more of an optimist than you, Izzy. It's definitely a challenging time, but I'm actually really excited. I mean, I have seen more engagement and outreach with this new administration in the past, month than I saw the past 4 years. We've already had multiple conversations with different tentacles of the Biden transition team, on the education side, on the youth sports side. Just this morning, there was an article in ESPN.com from Biden's brother quoting, saying that Biden believes that sports is one of the central things that binds us as Americans. So I feel like there's maybe not a champion yet, but there's someone who has an ear that's open to hearing from us in the White House, kind of on anything, but also really understands the openness of sports. So that's exciting. I also think there's a renewed interest in, with the change in the leadership or the shared leadership cycle in the Senate, there's going to be investment in infrastructure. There's going to be investment not only in COVID relief, but in recovery. And so, one of the major pieces of the COVID relief is focusing on small business, is trying to close the gaps of folks that were left out. Unfortunately, our relief effort didn't succeed last year in the sense that our bill wasn't passed. I think we saw a lot of our ideas and concepts integrated in some of the things that Tom was just speaking about, which is great. But we know it's not enough. And so, I think our focus needs to continue to make people understand in Washington that not all businesses have employees. Not all businesses are run by employees, and there needs to be an accounting for that in terms of how this relief is doled out. We've also seen Biden put in his package a prioritization for things like the child care independent tax credit, which, if any of you remember, was actually one of the provisions of our signature plays bill, trying to expand things like that to include provisions for youth sports as an eligible use of funds, just like the FIT Act, including physical activity in sports as an eligible use of funds. So I think, looking at these kinds of credits and incentives that are already part of this package, it gives us an opportunity to say, hey, what about sports? Hey, if you're prioritizing education, what about that important role sports plays in the educational experience? What about the important role sports plays in mental health? The Biden administration has signaled mental health to be a core priority, as has Congress. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here for us to weave sport into the fabric of these conversations that are going to be having, and position sports as a solution for change.
Yeah, I think, Terry, it's well said, and I share your optimism. And what I took from Izzy's remarks as well is that, look, the dynamic has shifted. It's not like just Rosie, just walk in and get it done, right? There's a lot of effort. We have to put in the work, right? Like Terry, we all have to put in the work to make this happen. But when you do, there's a more receptive environment because we have a good case to be made, and they're thinking about that. Izzy, to come back to you, I think one of the biggest things, and Terry will elaborate on this, but the hardest part here is that if you have a formula that's payroll based, but you have organizations that are volunteer driven or not based on payroll, you're just kind of left out, right? And so one of the things we were really focusing on is expanding the definition that was based more on your total receipts as an organization, your total revenue, as opposed to the payroll kind of calculation connected to that. And as you saw the work that happened in the past, and as you anticipate the future, do you anticipate more focused support for small business, more potential flexibility in the way that they think about delivering assistance to industries that may look different than other industries?
I do. And, I've talked to a few other folks in the general nonprofit space over the last few months. And it does seem like there is something of a groundswell developing to really address that exact issue. And I think maybe folks didn't get started early enough last year in socializing it and in kind of letting members know and trying to help the administration, the former administration, understand what the implications were. But I think you're exactly right. A formula that's driven by payroll headcount is just by nature very challenging for organizations that are not profit driven. And so I think that we need to continue to make that case. And I do hope that some of the larger nonprofits and representative organizations for them are much more active in making that case. Because I think from sports to food banks to a whole host of different groups, you have some real openings to help.
Yeah, and I think Kathy Robinson, Melissa, they both brought up points in the questions, and I feel free to use the Q&A tab to throw out their ideas or specific. What are your ideas, right? I think if you have ideas, if you were literally trying to write and influence legislation, what would you want to see? Because this is what the Play Sport Coalition is about, is just translating those ideas and priorities. And we've spent lots of time in dialogue and conversation. But Terry, something you brought up that I want to come back to so that the group understands the work ahead. There is a COVID relief package, $1.9 billion. Biden's focused on it. Schumer said he wants to focus on it. There'll be ways that they're going to think about helping and impacting industries and businesses. And we want to influence and shape that. But you also brought up an important point, which is there's lots of different ways that money is being spent by the government that could be connected to youth sports, the education budget, right? The infrastructure budget, budgets connected to the ways that you're thinking about investing, not just in, security and crime, but also alternative community kind of building strategies as well. So that's really appropriations related work. So Terry, how does that work when it comes to advocacy and the opportunities, if youth sports really connects to those outcomes, especially those sports-based youth development organizations, how can that be something that we can influence, and how would we try to influence that?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few ways to look at this. I mean, so one is there's a lot of programs out there that provide grants and resources to certain outcomes, right? Mental health, education, juvenile justice, and physical health. And right now, sports organizations are technically eligible. But I think one of the things we've seen really transcendent over the course of developing this Play Sports Coalition and the conversations we've been having and the advocacy we've been having is trying to get on the radar of members of Congress that sports isn't just something that's nice. Sports is necessary. Sports is critical to kids' social and emotional development and health. And therefore, it should be funded accordingly, right? So sports and the educational experience of sports should be part of whatever education relief is coming out, right? We're trying to get kids back in the classrooms. What about the safety and the needs that we have to get kids back safely playing school sports, right? That can't be not part of this conversation. Mental health is never been worse in this country, given everything that's going on right now, including, racial injustice. Sports is a real tool to help with these things. So part of our strategy needs to be getting with those appropriators and those members of Congress who are leading the legislation, leading the funds that are going to source these problems, and getting them to understand that sports is a solution, and a fundable solution at that, to these issues, and opening up resources that might otherwise not have been thought about. And then the other piece is making sure we're getting that support from the top, right? I mean, we have an executive now who's open to these kinds of conversations and can really, is clearly throwing his weight around, right? And so we want to make sure that he's throwing his weight our way and blazing the trail that sports can be part of these solutions and opening up some opportunities for us to advocate for it.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And when you were on the Hill, as we think about all the work the coalition's doing, and when we ask people to make phone calls or emails or get involved, a lot of people wonder, why, the why behind that. When you sit in the perspective, obviously, you work with Schumer, you work with Markey, two now really important senators. How does the effort of a coalition, how does that influence how people on the Hill choose to take action?
Well, look, I think everybody wants to have kind of their hometown, home state connection to a problem and to addressing it. And you guys have put together a diverse group of organizations that's kind of the perfect advocacy tool for connecting those dots for members of Congress. And I think that's a really important piece that a lot of other organizations don't necessarily have in place. So again, kudos to you guys for coming together and doing that. But I think from when you're talking about appropriations, when you're talking about grants and programs that exist, you still have to do some education, because my guess is that if the money was easily gettable, you guys, many of your members would have applied and gotten some of these grants already. When we're talking about appropriations, there has to be an authorization that occurs by Congress for a program, whatever it is, and then that money has to be appropriated by Congress to get out and spend. And so I think identifying which are the top 3, 4, 5 programs in the education space, in the economic development space, in the mental health space that we should target, and then kind of giving members the understanding, the education of, okay, this program is perfect. Here's why we should qualify if we don't. But also remembering that a lot of these programs they're grants from the federal government to state and local government, right? And then that's where the money is distributed often. There's as of now, earmarks, congressionally directed spending don't exist. And so getting that kind of a specialized, appropriation for an organization, for a sector, for a certain region, just isn't happening. That may change, but as of now, we need to identify the buckets of funds that we think are most appropriate, and then make the argument to appropriators and authorizers of why we should fit in.
Yeah, and one thing, and I'll Terry, kind of end the conversation here on this section of the conversation, is you've got to your point, and I think as a coalition, as we're imagining and resourcing the ability to think nationally, it's nationally at the federal level, but that state and local piece I think is really important, right? And as we think about how we mobilize, and I think the other thing is, Terry, you spend a lot of your time doing that education to try to help the members and their leading staff understand the broader context of what youth sports might be about. But there's a really important role for the stories and the voices to be heard from people within the coalition themselves, especially when people think it on the district level, and especially when people reflect the fact that everyone in Congress is very likely, the odds tell you, have a son or daughter or grandson or daughter or a niece and nephew, grandniece and nephew that are playing in a youth sports organization somewhere, that this is personal for them. Not to mention the kind of roles that all of them believe that this plays in the districts, which we saw with people like Max Rose and the 40 plus members of the House that signed on to kind of the youth sports legislation. So when we think about the future of the coalition and the roles of the people that are listening in and that will watch this, what's the role that you want them to play that can help us, make the case on the Hill?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said it well, we have to make it personal. The power is in the constituency. I mean, we saw, especially during COVID relief, when there's so much noise out there, members are going to be swayed by helping their constituents. And so, for us as a coalition to continue to activate and reach out, and as we identify our priorities, we're going to need everyone's help to make sure you're reaching out to your member of Congress to let them know how our asks are directly going to benefit your organization in their district and their constituents, because that's really what's going to get things across the finish line, especially in this competitive environment.
Yeah, and one thing, and as we think about the future of this kind of coalition, this movement around youth sports, it's not just about the immediate kind of relief and so many organizations that are struggling just to stay alive. How do we help, right? And if you haven't been helped by what's happening now, we're out there, and as a community, if we raise our voices, we want to continue to influence that. There's the ability to leverage appropriations and additional relief, the tax credits that ultimately make it easier for this industry to come back. And then we didn't even have time to get into the broader future of youth sports and the way we can actually make this institution better, the way we think about standards or governance and things like that, if we can help the organization survive and ultimately come back, then we have the muscle to then start to influence other ways as well. So with that, I want to turn to the final topic, but just thank Izzy and Terry for joining, and welcome Benita to the stage. And I want to start the conversation and pivot to the conversation. Before I introduce Benita, just with some breaking news, something that happened the very last minute within the administration, that the Trump administration that's worth noticing, which was there was effectively a wilderness protection order that existed that was connected to $125 million for the Outdoor Recreational Legacy Partnership Program, the ORLP. People here may or may not have even heard of it. But what that program was, that $125 million was really directed to provide grants to help people in urban areas to connect with outdoor spaces like parks and playgrounds and fields. And basically, they rescinded this at the very last minute of the last acts of the administration, which has then pulled money from those parks and investments, which serve those that have the most needs, community of colors and those in low-income communities. So one of the things that as an industry, we want to raise our voices, especially as the Biden administration really thinks about priorities to restore that funding among many other things. So we'll share a link in the into the chat that people can be aware of a petition effort that is being pushed ahead. And I think, again, it's just an illustration of why, as a group, we need to come together and advocate together, right? Whether it's about relief or an advocacy or the decisions, because right now they're not accounting for youth sports, and we want to make sure that they're doing that. That's why we're investing. That's really why we're building out the infrastructure for another phase. So the final part of the conversation today at the coalition level is to have Benita Fitzgerald Mosley join, and Benita needs very little introduction for most of you, and certainly not for me, because I'm fortunate enough now to consider her a colleague as the head of community impact at League Apps and the president of our Fun Play initiative. But Benita won the 1984 Olympic gold medal and has continued that kind of success in winning everywhere she's gone, whether it was leading the women in cable and television industry and building that up, whether it was her work with the US OPC or with USA Track and Field, where she helped kind of lead and influence performance that led to kind of record-setting gold medals in London. And of course, most recently, as being the CEO of Laureus Sports for Good Foundation in the United States, where she's really thought about sports-based youth development organization. And Benita has not only been part of the founding team and a leader among the leadership team of the Play Sports Coalition, but I think also can help us connect back to a broader message, which is it's tough, right? When you're in the youth sports world, for-profit or nonprofit, the communities that you serve, you're already sacrificing nights and weekends. You're putting yourself out there. And at a time when it's so tough, under such restrictions, under such financial pressures, we understand that there's a question of like, why continue? What does that look like? And I think it's helpful to remind all of us, because this is the story that we're also going to elevate to the Hill, about why youth sports, why a thriving youth sports culture is so critical to what we do. So maybe, Benita, you can start by sharing personally how sports has impacted your life, right? What role that played. And as we remind people of that, then let's ladder into a broader conversation of how we are collectively telling a story about youth sports that resonates. Sorry, Benita, you're muted.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hey, everybody, good afternoon. Some of you may have heard me speak of my gold medal and my youth sports experience in particular as a gift that keeps on giving. And I truly believe that we are all involved in certainly a labor of love, but a labor that provides such benefits to young athletes throughout their growing up years, and has benefits that accrue to them and to their communities while they're participating, but for many, many years to come. I feel like as a youth athlete being introduced to sports in middle school, first in community playing softball and doing gymnastics and that kind of thing. But by the time I got to middle school, I was fortunate enough, I grew up and still live now in Northern Virginia. And we had access to all kinds of youth sports activities, and I had the benefit of that, building that self-esteem, having then more success in school after I started participating in sport, and having those positive experiences, creating leadership development opportunities for myself, both in school and out of school, give me the confidence to be a leader in the classroom and be a leader in the community. And of course, as many parents know, having the opportunity to get a college scholarship and have my tuition and room and board paid for by the University of Tennessee was huge for my parents and a great opportunity for me. Career-wise, every job I've ever had. Somehow I can harken back to a connection within my sports background that has led me to that opportunity or introduced me. Even my most recent role now with League Apps, I haven't even ever met Jeremy in person, but we've gotten to know each other through the Play Sports Coalition. And finally, my family. I met my husband through some fellow Olympians. And of course, we have two wonderful kids now, 22 and 17. I can't believe I'm saying those numbers out loud. They had birthdays recently, but my daughter is still playing high school sports. And so everything that parents are feeling and experiencing through this COVID crisis, I'm experiencing myself with remote schooling, with the challenges now of having kids not have access to those extracurricular activities that they normally would have access to. Thankfully, in Virginia, we're having truncated seasons and delayed seasons. And so she's now finally, as in the past month, being able to compete once again, but she's also a club volleyball player. So I'm experiencing these things as a parent as well, but I see the benefit of, where she was and when all of her sports came to a screeching halt in March, April, May, and the mental health challenges that she experienced ready to just write off sports altogether late summer. And I'm just so thankful that she found it within her, the resilience that she needed in order to come back and decide to put her all back into sports. And so this is a trying time for all of us, but I just wanted to reiterate that it is the gift that keeps on giving. And as youth sports organizers all over the country, you're providing that wonderful gift to so many kids that really need it, particularly at this time.
Benita, thank you for sharing that story. And I think it reminds us that there's so many yous out there that in any one of the organizations that are out there that are serving youth sports, and for that matter, adult sports, local sports, unified sports, whatever it may be, they're creating and turning and impacting people's lives in ways that can go on and impact all kinds of lives through that experience. One of the things I think we heard from Izzy and Terry is a lot of our ability to advocate as a coalition is how we help tell the story of youth sports, right? And help people understand that this is not an optional thing, that we think it's an important thing. And there's been a lot of conversations about yesterday, for example, in the inaugural address, I think the word unity was used, I think 11 plus times in this speech. So as we think about as a country that's trying to figure out how to bring people together, and you think about even the context of the Olympic movement and what that was about bringing the world together through sport, what is the role? How do we think about that story of the power of sport to unite communities and remind ourselves of that?
I think about even, from pro sports coming back and how it has united our from a fan standpoint, watching the playoffs of the NFL, seeing the NBA come back so quickly after finishing their season in the early part of the fall. And just the excitement of having that unity of cheering for our sports teams again. But with youth sports, I mean, I talked about it, alluded to it a few seconds ago about my daughter, just having that ability to reunite with her friends and her teammates. It is, I think, across political lines, when we're dealing with the political divides that we've seen play out in front of our television screens and in our communities over the last definitely several weeks, but several years. It's a time and a place with youth sports where parents and kids and community come together, and we are experiencing joy, certainly the physical activity, but we're experiencing an opportunity to unite together for a common purpose and enjoy something together that transcends all the differences that may seem so important in other ways. Also, I think the ability for sport to impact communities more directly. And Terry alluded to that earlier, where this has to do with education or employment, social cohesion, social impact and social justice. And so I know that many of you as sports-based youth development organizations are focused on those social outcomes as being the primary focus of your work. And certainly the sport is a vehicle for that. And so very directly through sports-based youth development organizations, I see the building of community and that unity being important. But as a whole, sport has always been a place and continues to be that place, I think, that can bring us back together if we use it intentionally in the right way.
I think it's such an important point. It was alluded to by Terry in the ESPN article this morning about referencing Joe Biden's brother. but there's not that, we've lost a lot of the spaces that allows us to form common connections and remind us of our common humanity. And interestingly enough, the arts is one places for that to happen. People have been talking about that, about poetry, as people listened to the Youth Poet Laureate yesterday. Music was another good example. I saw an interview this morning with Garth Brooks when people were saying, hey, is it political if you're showing up, the inauguration, blah, blah. And he's like, look, music is one of the things that we can all relate to. It doesn't matter where you're from or where you live, like we can appreciate that. And I think what sports, especially youth sports, is it is such a powerful form of having us connect together, through kids and in our communities, and remember that. And when you think about all the goodness that comes from sports, you talked about it. I think the other side of the coin is if sports is so important, right? If youth sports is so transformative for the people in it, and people who play sports and those experiences they have, if some people don't have access to it, right? If they can't afford it, right? It's not available to them, right? The right kind of experiences, then that creates that by definition is inequity, right? When you have something that's so important, yet people are denied access to it, that creates a moral imperative to address that. So talk a little bit about not only the conversation we're having about unity in this country, but also the conversation we're having about equity, right, and justice, and the role that sports can play connected to that, and how, as a coalition, as a youth sports organization, when we think about funding underserved communities, how we're trying to kind of, as a coalition, try to influence that.
Right. So, I know, I don't know if Renata's on the phone or not. Renata Simrel runs the LA84 Foundation. Another part of their foundation is the Play Equity Fund, and really focusing and doubling down on the idea. Certainly, we've seen how healthcare disparities, income disparities, how the pandemic is impacting different communities in different ways. It's been way more visible, I think, to all of us in the past several months. Well, in the play space, youth sports, it continues to be a divide, and it has grown certainly over the past several months. And so with the Play Sports Coalition, our mission is to build a movement that elevates the value of youth sports and influences both institutions and markets to drive equity and social change. And so that's a mouthful to say, we're looking for key outcomes around social outcomes. We alluded to them earlier: health, education, social justice, cohesion, but also participation and increasing the number of kids and where those kids are that have access to the benefit of sport, and resources, in creating an environment where the pie gets bigger. And so that not only are we trying or thinking about ways to get more appropriation money or through the latest COVID release bill, but all the way from the grassroots to the grass tops, advocacy to ensure that we're tapping into all the areas and resources available to make that pie bigger so that more kids have an opportunity to play. The other ways to do this are through collaboration. Izzy talked about it earlier. This is a unique thing. This is the first time in our country's history where this many youth sports organizations have come together under a common umbrella. This late breaking news and the petition that the Project Play has put out there, please sign it. This is a show of force opportunity for this coalition to come back and tell the government, no, that, just let a couple days go by. Don't let these opportunities and the access to these play spaces and these outdoor spaces go unnoticed, and allow that to create, again, an even larger divide between the haves and the have-nots. And then building a movement is really where it's at, because we have to make people more aware. Terry talked about it, people think of this as a nice to have. It's not a nice to have, it's imperative that kids have this opportunity to play, the communities have an opportunity to come together about things and unify, and to create opportunities and participation opportunities for more kids so that they can all benefit, and that all communities can benefit from the benefits of sport.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I want to give a shout out to Lou Salvadori for his post in the chat tool. I actually left that part of the question. I was going to reference the Nelson Mandela quote. And two interesting things, Lou, you probably don't know, is one, that Laureus Sports for Good Foundation, which Benito was the CEO of, when Nelson Mandela gave, that quote is from a speech he gave at the Laureus, the inaugural Laureus Sport for Good Awards. And so, is inextricably linked to to that moment, that organization where Mandela said that. And interestingly enough, from every League Apps office we've ever had, we've had that quote on the wall. And if you think about it in a moment, right, if we're making that case, not only to Capitol Hill and the administration, but at the state and local level, to funders that are out there as a group. Now think about Nelson Mandela leaving jail, right? And what South Africa offered, right? He had been jailed for a couple of decades, right? If there's a longer story, I'm not going to get into about the role that sport played while he was in jail on Robben Island with soccer, right? Which itself is a powerful story. And when he thought about how to bring this country together, apartheid, right? Racial divisions. What were the tools at his disposal to think about how you brought that society together? It was sport, right? One of his first actions was actually going to a soccer match. And then obviously we know the story of the Rugby World Cup and the Springboks, and how he, by showing the support for sport, but that had been traditionally a support supported by the Afrikaners, the whites in South Africa, was a signal that the country could get together. So if Nelson Mandela, right, they don't make him like Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela, a leader like him, says something like that quote that you just put in there, Lou, about that, right? When we think about where we're at as a society, which as much as our challenges, right, we still are a democracy. We haven't experienced apartheid, but we do have profound inequities. We have profound challenges. We have divisions. Sports is a tool. And if we can have people understand that, that not only gives us purpose in the work that we do, but it's a story that all those decision makers need to understand as well. Benita, a final question or comment to end with, which is, it's a tough time for youth organizations. You understand how challenging this for sports-based nonprofits, the rest of the industry. What's the final message you want to deliver to them about where the coalition is going to go, and more importantly, in a minute or so wrap, how should they think about hanging in there, because it's so tough right now for this industry.
I mean, they have to hang in. I know it's difficult, and I know even the latest stimulus did not address all of your needs, but I know you've figured out ways you've been resilient. The kids have been resilient. They were running around playing sports and masks and social distancing during practice, and parents can't be there and spectators aren't there, but yet and still you've kept on going. You've been doing things virtually that you otherwise might have done in person. You figured out a way to deliver the programs and the youth development that you needed to do. And so hang in there. I think help is coming. We know the vaccine is helping us turn the corner. We're, I think, past the post holiday increase. And so, hang in there the next 3 to 6 months. And I think, what you're going to be a cornerstone to our country being able to bounce back and bounce back well. The kids that you're dealing with and the kids that you're bringing together are our future. And you saw that yesterday on display with the poet, but you've got many kids as brilliant as she in your programs, and you're nurturing and developing them on the field of play and off is critical to our bouncing back as a nation. Thank you for what
I think that's right. And I think there's an interesting final message as you think about the messages and conversations yesterday, which is one, as much as we might be divided, when we come together, that's how we meet our moments. I mean, the challenges, it's going to be true as a society as we confront, the economic crisis and a health crisis and an inequity crisis and a climate crisis and all a democratic crisis, all the things that we've contended with. But it's also true of youth sports, right? As we come together, that's how we ultimately can have change and influence. And we do that through our own individual actions, and we do that through our voice. And as a coalition, we're committed to doubling down our efforts to get even louder, right? And more influential and more impactful at all the different levels that need to happen. So we thank you all for being part of it. We encourage you to go to the playsportscoalition.org to learn more about what we're up to and sign up, be involved, share that link out for the petition, and then stay tuned because if you want to get involved in that, go ahead and signal that. Follow up with Jenny and she can put her email in the chat. You can follow up on the Slack group where you can continue the conversations and connect together. So when people like Melissa Merson have ideas about what to do when she's sitting with her congressman, she has to wait no longer, right? We're there to provide that tool and input, and because it's going to take all of us together. That's what we learn from sports, right? We win as a team. So thank you. Thanks to all those that have led the coalition and obviously incredible work that Terry's done and the entire steering committee, and then certainly all of you, and have a great day. We appreciate you.
Bye-bye.